Chinese philosophy almost never invented a god. In this video, we move through a world where morality doesn't come from heaven, where human nature is questioned instead of comforted, and where power, ethics, and truth are constantly rewritten. Tonight we will visit each of the great schools of Chinese thought. We will sit with Confucius in the courtyard and listen to him talk about ritual and love, and what it means to be a decent human being in a world that often refuses to cooperate. We will follow Laozi into the mountains and try to understand a force so vast and so quiet that the moment you name it, you have already lost it. We will wrestle with Zhuangzi, who will laugh at your certainties and ask you whether you are a man dreaming of a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming of a man. We will face the cold logic of the legalists, who believe that human nature was so corrupt that only law and punishment could save civilization. And we will meet the strange, gentle, radical Mozi, who preached universal love centuries before Christianity and was largely forgotten for it. If there is no God to punish wrongdoing, who keeps people honest? If morality is not commanded from above, where does it come from? If the universe is indifferent to human suffering, as some of these thinkers believed, does that make our suffering meaningless? Or does it make our love for each other more heroic? Before we begin, if this kind of slow, thoughtful content is something you want more of, please consider subscribing to Maybe Meaning. If you enjoy this kind of journey, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel before we begin. My words are nothing without those who answer them with a simple thank you. And finally, if you're interested in philosophy or psychology from any tradition, American, Indian, European, Russian, British, leave a short comment with the topic you want explored next. Now, let us begin. Before we can understand why Chinese philosophy has almost no God, we have to understand the world it was born into. Imagine China, somewhere around the 6th century before the Common Era. The Zhou dynasty, which had once held the country together under the idea of a unified heaven-ordered civilization, was fracturing. Local lords were becoming kings in everything but name. Wars were constant. Old certainties were dissolving. The rituals that had once connected the living to their ancestors, the king to heaven, the farmer to the land, all of these were being disrupted, mocked, ignored, performed emptily by people who no longer believed in them. This is the world in which Confucius was born, around 551 BCE, in the state of Lu. And this is important, because the questions that Chinese philosophy asked first were not the questions that Western philosophy asked first. Western philosophy in Greece was born asking, what is the world made of? Is it water, or fire, or atoms? How do we know what we know? What is truly real, and what is mere appearance? Chinese philosophy was born asking, how do we live together? How do we stop killing each other? What does it mean to be a good person in a world that is falling apart? How do we create a society that is actually worth living in? This is not a small difference. It is a difference that shapes everything that follows. When your first question is, what is the world made of? You eventually arrive at the problem of a creator. You ask, who or what made this substance? What caused the beginning? You build toward a first cause, a prime mover, a god. When your first question is, how do we live together? You do not necessarily need a god at all. You need wisdom, you need ritual, you need relationships, you need something like virtue. The Chinese thinkers were not ignoring metaphysics. They were simply, in the beginning, more urgently concerned with ethics. And that initial urgency left a fingerprint on everything that followed. There was, of course, a concept of heaven in early Chinese thought. The Shang dynasty, which preceded the Zhou, worshipped a high deity called Shangdi, the Lord above. The Zhou, when they overthrew the Shang, inherited this concept and transformed it into something called Tian, which is usually translated as heaven. But Tian was already something different from the gods of other traditions. It was not a person, it was not a being with a face and desires and emotions. It was more like a moral order built into the structure of the universe. It was the source of virtue, the standard against which rulers were judged, the force that granted or withdrew the mandate of heaven from dynasties as they rose and fell. When a dynasty lost the mandate of heaven, it meant that the dynasty had become corrupt, had stopped following the moral order, and therefore the universe had stopped supporting it. This was not a miraculous intervention by a divine being. It was more like gravity. If you stop holding things up, they fall. This is the world in which Confucius looked around and felt a deep, aching sadness. The rituals were empty, the rulers were cruel and petty. The old order was gone, and nobody seemed to remember why any of it had mattered in the first place. So Confucius decided to teach. He gathered students around him, often while traveling from state to state, trying to find a ruler who would actually listen to his advice. He almost never found one. His political career was a long series of disappointments, but his teaching became one of the most influential bodies of thought in human history. And here is the striking thing. In all of that teaching, Confucius almost never talked about God. His students asked him about spiritual matters, about the spirits of the dead, about divine intervention, about what happens after we die. And almost every time, Confucius changed the subject. "You do not yet understand the living," he said once. "How can you understand the dead?" This was not evasion out of ignorance. Confucius knew what his students were asking. He simply believed that these questions were not the most useful ones. The most useful question, the only question that really mattered for how to actually live, was how to treat the people around you. And that question, he believed, had an answer that did not require invoking the supernatural. The central concept in Confucian thought is something called Ren. It is usually translated as benevolence or humaneness or goodness or even love. But none of these translations quite captures what Confucius meant by it. Ren is something like the deepest quality of being fully human. It is what you are when you are at your best, when you are genuinely present with the person in front of you, when you feel their suffering as your own, when you act with care not because you are being watched, but because care is simply the natural expression of being a fully realized person. The character for Ren in Chinese is made up of two simpler characters, the character for person and the character for two. Ren is, literally, the quality that exists between people. You cannot be Ren alone. Ren only exists in relationship. This is already a very different picture of morality from what Western religion typically offers. In much of Western religious thought, morality is a command. God says, do this, do not do that. Goodness is obedience, evil is disobedience. The individual soul stands before the divine lawgiver and is judged. In Confucian thought, morality is a practice. It is something you do with other people. It grows through relationships. It deepens through ritual. It is not handed down from above, but cultivated from within through years of patient, deliberate, sustained effort. The Confucian concept of ritual, Li, is crucial here. Ritual does not mean empty ceremony. It means all of the structured, patterned ways in which human beings relate to each other with appropriate care. Greeting someone properly, serving food with the right disposition, mourning the dead with genuine grief, expressed in the right way, at the right time, performing your role in the family, in society, in the state, with full attention and sincerity. Ritual is how Ren becomes visible. Ritual is how the inner quality of humaneness gets expressed in the outer world. This might sound rigid, it might sound like mere conformity, but Confucius was extremely clear that ritual without genuine feeling was worthless. Empty ceremony was worse than no ceremony at all. What a man dislikes in his superiors, he said, let him not display in the treatment of his inferiors. The measure of whether you were performing ritual correctly was not whether you followed the form, but whether the form was expressing something real in you. And here is where the moral question becomes genuinely difficult. How do you cultivate Ren if you were not born with it in full? Confucius believed that human beings were naturally capable of virtue. He was not naive about human weakness, but he thought that the capacity for goodness was something built into the human constitution, the way the capacity for language is built into the human constitution. You are born with the equipment. Whether you develop it or let it atrophy depends on you, on your teachers, on your environment, on your sustained effort. This is a deeply hopeful view and also a deeply demanding one. There is no grace, in the Christian sense, that steps in to save you from your own failure. There is no divine forgiveness that wipes the slate clean. There is only the long, patient, difficult work of becoming a better person, one day at a time, one relationship at a time. The Confucian philosopher Mencius, who came about a century after Confucius, pushed this even further. He argued that human nature was intrinsically good, not just capable of goodness, but originally, fundamentally, in its natural state, good. Evil entered human life when this natural goodness was suppressed by bad environments, bad rulers, poverty. This was a radical political claim. If human beings are naturally good, then a society that produces widespread wickedness is a society that has failed its people. The ruler who presides over misery and poverty and corruption is not merely witnessing human weakness, he is causing it. Mencius was not shy about saying this to rulers directly. He once told a king who was worried about the fact that people were migrating away from his state that the solution was not to improve military defenses, but to govern better. Make the land productive, feed the people, give them time to cultivate their families and their own virtue. Then they will come, and they will stay. The king did not particularly like this answer, but Mencius was insistent. The standard of heaven, he said, was moral. A ruler who governed badly had lost the mandate of heaven, and a people had the right, in fact the obligation, to remove a ruler who had lost the mandate. Where is God in all of this? God is not quite there. Heaven is there, as a kind of moral gravity, a force that rewards good governance and punishes bad governance through the natural mechanisms of social collapse and peasant uprising. But heaven does not intervene personally. It does not speak. It does not send angels. It is more like a pressure, an orientation, a weight that pulls toward a certain kind of social order when conditions are right. You feel it most clearly in its absence when things fall apart. Now we move from the warm, social, relationship-centered world of Confucius into something altogether stranger, around the same time that Confucius was teaching in the state of Lu, or perhaps somewhat later, perhaps earlier. Nobody is entirely sure. A text appeared in China that would become one of the most read books in the history of the world. It is called the Tao Te Ching, and it is attributed to a figure called Laozi, the Old Master, who may or may not have been a real historical person. The Tao Te Ching begins with a sentence that immediately tells you that something unusual is happening. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. This is the opening move, and it is a move that most Western philosophical and religious traditions would find extremely unsettling. If the ultimate principle of the universe cannot be named, cannot be described, cannot be talked about without distorting it, then what exactly are we supposed to do with it? The Tao is usually translated as the way. But the way of what? The way of the universe. The way things naturally move and change and flow when they are not being forced or manipulated or interfered with. The Tao is not a god. It is not a person. It has no will, no desire, no intention, no plan for human beings. It simply is. It has always been. It was before the universe existed, and it will be after the universe ends, though even to say that is probably already to say too much, because the Tao is beyond time as well as beyond description. The Tao Te Ching says, "The Tao that is bright seems dark. The Tao that advances seems to retreat. The Tao that is level seems bumpy. The highest virtue seems like a valley. The greatest whiteness seems spotted. The most abundant virtue seems insufficient. The most established virtue seems flimsy. The purest simplicity seems changeable." Everything that seems like a straightforward description of the Tao turns out to be its opposite. The Tao is the mother of all things, and it is empty. It is older than the gods, and it has no age. It is the source of heaven and earth, and it precedes them. You can spend a lifetime with this text and still not feel that you have grasped it. And that, Laozi would say, is exactly right. If you feel you have grasped it, you have not. But here is the practical heart of Taoist philosophy, the thing that makes it not just a mystical meditation on the ineffable, but a philosophy with actual implications for how to live. The concept of Wu Wei. Wu Wei is usually translated as non-action or effortless action or actionless action. It sounds paradoxical because it is. What it means roughly is this: the best way to act is to act in alignment with the natural flow of things, rather than forcing your own agenda against that flow. A river does not push. It finds the lowest point and goes there. Over millennia, it cuts through stone, not because of violence, but because of persistence and alignment with gravity. The Taoist sage is like this. She does not struggle against the current of reality. She does not impose her plans on the world. She pays close attention to what the situation actually calls for, and she responds with the minimum necessary action to bring about the appropriate result. This sounds gentle, and in many ways it is. But there is a harder edge to it. Wu Wei is also a critique of Confucianism. Laozi in the Tao Te Ching is skeptical of benevolence, of righteousness, of ritual, of all the concepts that Confucius held most sacred. When the great Tao is forgotten, he writes, benevolence and righteousness appear. And later, when the 6 family relationships are out of harmony, filial piety and compassion appear. When the state falls into chaos, loyal ministers appear. The point is brutal. Virtue is what you reach for when the natural order has broken down. If things were working properly, you would not need to preach goodness. The goodness would simply flow, the way water flows downhill. This is a devastating critique if you take it seriously. Confucius built an entire civilization on the cultivation of ritual and virtue. Laozi says that the very fact that we are trying to cultivate virtue is evidence that something has already gone wrong. Virtue is a bandage. The Tao is health. Is Laozi right? This is one of those questions that does not have a comfortable answer. Think about it this way. When you love someone deeply, you do not calculate whether to be kind to them. You do not consult a list of moral obligations and decide that today is a day for benevolence. You are simply present with them, and goodness flows naturally from that presence. It requires no effort because it is not a performance of virtue. It is what genuine care looks like when nothing is in the way. But when the love is strained, when there are grievances and resentments and old wounds, then you have to work. You have to remember to be patient. You have to make a deliberate effort to be kind when your instinct is to withdraw or retaliate. This is what Confucius is describing. This is virtue as effort. Laozi is describing what happens before you need the effort. Both are real. Both are necessary. The question of which one gets more philosophical attention is the question of which human situation you are primarily addressing. The situation of someone who already knows peace, or the situation of someone trying to rebuild it. Now we arrive at the most mysterious, the most playful, the most quietly unsettling figure in the whole of Chinese philosophy. A man named Zhuangzi, known as Zhuangzi, who lived in the 4th century BCE and wrote a book that is like nothing else in the entire tradition of human thought. The book called the Zhuangzi is full of stories, parables, jokes, riddles, and meditations. It is also full of characters who die and then seem entirely untroubled by the fact of their death. Characters who transform into other forms and find this interesting. Conversations between rivers and seas and turtles and mushrooms. It is a book that treats ordinary philosophical categories with extreme suspicion and then builds something stranger and deeper out of the ruins. The most famous passage in the Zhuangzi is very short. Zhuangzi tells us that once he dreamed he was a butterfly. He was flying around, happy to be a butterfly, entirely without any sense of being Guangzhou. Then he woke up, and now he is Zhuangzhou again. But here is the question. Is he a man who dreamed he was a butterfly, or is he a butterfly now dreaming he is a man? The question is not just a cute puzzle. It is pointing at something that Zhuangzi takes very seriously. The arbitrary nature of the categories we use to organize experience. What is the difference between man and butterfly? We say, obviously, there is a difference. One is a person, and one is an insect. But Zhuangzi asks, where exactly is the difference located? Is it in the material substance of the body? But substances transform. Is it in the continuity of consciousness? But consciousness itself appears and disappears in sleep and dream. What exactly is the thing you are so sure is you? This sounds like it could collapse into nihilism. If there is no stable self, if categories are arbitrary, if the boundary between this and that is always shifting, then why does anything matter? Zhuangzi has an answer to this, and it is subtle enough to miss if you read him too quickly. His point is not that nothing matters. His point is that the way you typically hold on to things, the way you clutch at your identity and your opinions and your certainties, actually prevents you from engaging with life as it really is. It makes you rigid. It makes you afraid. It makes you fight against transformation instead of moving with it. Death is the most extreme example. Most people fear death because they experience it as the end of something precious, the self. Zhuangzi says, what if the self is not what you think it is? What if what you call yourself is actually more like a wave on the ocean, a temporary pattern in a continuous flow? The wave does not disappear when it breaks on the shore. The water is still there. The energy is still moving. This is not reincarnation in the Indian Buddhist sense. Zhuangzi does not promise you a personal continuity that transcends death. What he offers is something stranger, a release from the terror of death through a more accurate understanding of what you are in the first place. And here is where it touches the question of God most directly. Zhuangzi does not need a God because he does not think the universe needs a moral overseer. The universe is not a court. It is not judging you. It does not care in the way that a personal God would care, whether you are good or evil, successful or failed, wise or foolish. The Tao moves through all things equally. The caterpillar and the emperor, the wise woman and the murderer, all are equally expressions of the Tao, all equally temporary patterns in the flow. This is deeply unsettling if you approach it from the expectation that the universe owes you something, that there should be a final accounting, that suffering should be explained and compensated, that evil should be punished and goodness rewarded. Zhuangzi says that expectation is the source of your suffering. The universe does not owe you anything. It is not against you. It is simply moving, the way weather moves, the way seasons change, the way everything that has a form eventually loses that form, and the matter and energy flow into something else. Is this cold? Is it nihilistic? Or is it in some way an invitation to a deeper peace? Zhuangzi would say that the question itself is already loaded with the wrong assumptions. Cold implies a comparison to warmth, and Zhuangzi is not offering a temperature. He is offering a different way of being in the world altogether, a way that does not require the universe to be what you want it to be, a way that finds the natural order of things as it actually is sufficient. He tells a story of a man named Laozi who thought he had mastered the wind. He could ride the wind, and this felt like great freedom. But Zhuangzi says still, depending on something, true freedom would be riding nothing at all, being the wind itself, being the movement rather than the rider. What would that feel like? Zhuangzi is pointing at something that resists description, which is why he uses stories and jokes and impossible questions instead of philosophical argument. The thing he is pointing at cannot be argued into existence. It can only be glimpsed, perhaps in a moment of deep ease, when the ordinary struggle of trying to be something specific has briefly let go. There is a line in the Tao Te Ching that strikes many Western readers as deeply troubling. Heaven and earth are not humane. They regard all things as straw dogs. Straw dogs were ritual objects in ancient China. They were made with great care and reverence before the ceremony, used in the ceremony, and then discarded afterward, burned or trampled or simply thrown away. They had no further value once the ceremony was complete. Laozi says, "This is how heaven and earth regard all things, including human beings. This is not cruelty, it is indifference, and the distinction matters enormously." The Western religious tradition in its mainstream forms holds that God is personally invested in human beings. God loves us individually, God watches over each soul, God hears prayers, God intervenes, God judges, God cares. The Taoist tradition says, the universe does not care. It is not against you. It simply moves according to its own nature, which includes you, the way it includes everything else, as a temporary pattern in a flow that has been going on much longer than you and will continue long after you are gone. Now here is the moral question. Which of these is actually more conducive to human goodness? You might think that if God is watching and will punish wrongdoing, people will behave better. This is the basic argument for divine enforcement of morality. Without a cosmic judge, the argument goes, morality is just convention, something humans made up and can unmake whenever it becomes inconvenient. But there is a counter-argument that the Chinese tradition has been making for 2,500 years. If your goodness depends on being watched, then you are not actually good. You are merely compliant. You are not virtuous. You are obedient. And obedient people, when the overseer looks away, or when they convince themselves that no one is watching, or when they find a way to rationalize that their particular bad action falls outside the category of what the overseer cares about, will do terrible things. The Confucian tradition argues that what you need is not external enforcement, but internal transformation. You need people who are genuinely good, not people who are pretending to be good under threat. And genuine goodness cannot be commanded from outside. It has to be cultivated from within. The Taoist tradition makes an even sharper version of this point. The more you govern through law and punishment, the less internal virtue the people will develop. When the laws are numerous, robbers and thieves multiply, This is a specific claim about social psychology. People who live under a system of external enforcement never develop the internal resources to govern themselves. Remove the enforcement and they collapse into disorder. A society based on genuine virtue, on the other hand, might need very little enforcement at all. The laws would be few and simple because most people would already be doing the right thing. Is this idealistic? Certainly. Has any actual society fully achieved it? Probably not. But as a direction to aim for, as a critique of pure legalism and external authority, it remains one of the most interesting ideas ever articulated. And it was articulated without any reference to God. The moral universe of the Tao does not punish you for doing wrong. It does not need to. Doing wrong is its own punishment, not because the universe sends retribution, but because acting against the natural flow of things creates friction, suffering, difficulty. A corrupt ruler does not need divine punishment. The social fabric he has damaged will eventually collapse around him. The logic is immanent, not transcendent. The consequences are built into the structure of things, not handed down from above. This is either deeply reassuring or deeply terrifying, depending on what you are hoping the universe will do for you. In the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, at roughly the same time that Confucius's ideas were spreading, a very different thinker arose. His name was Mozi, known as Mozi, and he founded a school of thought called Mohism that was, for a time, considered as important as Confucianism, and then largely disappeared for reasons that are themselves a moral puzzle. Mozi was, in many ways, the most radical ethical thinker in early Chinese history. He proposed something called deity, which is usually translated as universal love or impartial caring. The idea is startling in its simplicity. Mozi said, "You should care about other people as much as you care about yourself. You should care about yourself. You should care about your family. You should care about people in other states as much as you care about people in your own state." If this sounds like a familiar idea, that is because a version of it appears in Christianity, in Buddhism, in many of the world's major ethical traditions. What makes Mozi interesting is that he arrived at it through what he considered to be a purely rational argument, and he arrived at it in a context where the primary competing view was the Confucian emphasis on graded love, which says that you owe your parents more than you owe strangers, and your family more than you owe your neighbors, and your community more than you owe distant nations. Mozi thought graded love was the source of most of the world's suffering. Why do people go to war? Because they care more about their state than about other states. Why do families take advantage of other families? Because they care more about their own. Why do lords oppress peasants? Because they care more about their own comfort than about the suffering of those beneath them. If everyone practiced universal love, all of these problems would dissolve. A lord who cared about the peasants as much as he cared about himself would not oppress them. A state that cared about other states as much as it cared about itself would not go to war. The logic seems almost unassailable. So why did Confucians object? The Confucian objection was this: what Mozi is proposing is psychologically impossible for human beings. We are built for partiality. We form attachments that are inherently graded by proximity and relationship. To demand that I love a stranger as much as I love my mother is to demand that I perform a moral contortion that is not available to the actual human psychology I have been given. And if a moral demand is psychologically impossible, it is not a moral demand. It is a fantasy. But here is the harder question: even if the Confucians are right, that graded love is natural, does that make it good? We are naturally inclined to many things that we would consider immoral if examined carefully. The mere fact that something comes easily to us does not mean it is the right way to organize a civilization. Mozi also had a concept of heaven, and here he actually comes closest to something resembling a god. He believed that heaven approved of universal love and disapproved of partiality. He believed that heaven could be appealed to through prayer and ritual. This made Mohism somewhat more theistic than Confucianism or Taoism. But even Mozi's heaven is not quite a personal god in the Western sense. It is more like a cosmic principle that expresses itself as a preference for universal care. Mohism also advocated for extreme frugality, pacifism, and the rejection of elaborate ritual. Mozi was horrified by the expense of Confucian funerals and ceremonies. All of that wealth spent on burial goods and feasting could be used to feed the hungry. The elaborate music and dance that the Confucians celebrated as the highest expression of civilization, Mozi saw as a waste of resources that could be redirected to the actual relief of human suffering. This is, in a strange way, a more utilitarian position than anything in Confucianism. Measure everything by its practical effect on human welfare, discard what does not produce measurable benefit. The Mohists were also extraordinary engineers and military strategists. They developed elaborate defensive technologies and would travel to states that were being threatened by aggressive neighbors in order to help them fortify their defenses. This was a practical expression of universal love. We do not care which state is being attacked. We care about the people inside it. Why did Mohism largely disappear while Confucianism survived to shape Chinese civilization for 2,000 years? This is a question without a fully satisfying answer. Part of it is political. When the Han Dynasty made Confucianism the official state ideology, Mohism lost its institutional support. Part of it is perhaps sociological. Mozi's ideas demanded too much. Universal love without partiality is a standard that very few human beings can actually meet. And a philosophy that sets unattainable standards tends to either become hypocritical or irrelevant. But there is also something darker to consider, a philosophy that challenges the natural human tendency toward tribalism and self-interest does not make friends with the powerful. The powerful benefit from partiality. They benefit from the idea that it is natural and right to favor your own. Mozi threatened that. He was, in some sense, too early, or perhaps just honest, in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. At roughly the same period, another school of thought was developing in China that took an entirely different view of human nature and the appropriate response to it. The Legalists, whose most sophisticated exponent was Han Fei, who died in 233 BCE, looked at human beings and saw something that neither Confucius nor Laozi nor Mozi wanted to acknowledge directly. They saw selfishness. Pure, consistent, reliable selfishness. Han Fei did not believe that human beings were naturally good, as Mencius claimed. He did not believe that virtue could be cultivated through ritual and education, as Confucius thought. He did not believe that universal love could be achieved through moral persuasion, as Mozi hoped. And he did not believe that following the natural flow of things would produce a just society, as the Taoists imagined. He believed that human beings were primarily motivated by self-interest, not always consciously, not always crudely, but fundamentally and reliably. And he thought that anyone who designed a system of government based on the assumption of human virtue was setting up a system that would inevitably be exploited by the selfish to the detriment of everyone else. Therefore, the solution was not to try to make people virtuous. The solution was to design systems in which self-interest reliably produced socially desirable outcomes. This is a strikingly modern idea. It is the basic insight behind much of economic theory, behind institutional design, behind the logic of checks and balances. You do not need honest politicians if the system makes dishonesty too costly. You do not need generous merchants if the competitive market makes generosity advantageous. You do not need people to care about others if the law makes harming others unprofitable. Han Fei was not a monster. He was a clear-eyed realist who had watched the chaos of the warring states period and concluded that warm moral ideals were not enough to stop it. What was needed was law, strictly applied, consistently enforced, without favoritism or exception. Confucius had said that the ruler's virtue was the source of good governance. If the ruler was good, the people would follow. Han Fei said, "This is a child's fantasy. A good ruler who builds a system that depends on his personal virtue is creating a system that will collapse the moment a bad ruler inherits it. Build institutions instead. Build laws, build enforcement mechanisms. Then it does not matter whether the ruler is good or bad, because the system does not depend on his goodness. There is something chillingly right about this, and there is something chillingly incomplete about it. The chillingly right part. History has repeatedly confirmed that systems which depend on the personal virtue of leaders tend to fail when the leaders are not virtuous, which is most of the time. Institutions that create accountability, that distribute power, that make corruption costly, do tend to produce better outcomes than systems based on trust in the goodness of whoever happens to be in charge. the chillingly incomplete part, what happens when the law itself is unjust. Legalism, taken to its extreme, produces perfect obedience to a system that might be monstrous. The Qin dynasty, which unified China in 221 BCE using legalist principles, was the most efficient and most brutal state China had ever seen. It worked brilliantly for about 15 years and then collapsed in revolution. The people had been managed perfectly and they hated it. The Qin dynasty burned books. It suppressed all the schools of thought that questioned state authority. It standardized weights and measures and roads and scripts across the empire, which was a genuine achievement. It also worked people to death on massive construction projects and executed dissent without hesitation. Was this good governance? It was efficient governance. The distinction matters, and here too God is entirely absent. The legalists had no use for heaven or Tao or moral cultivation. They had laws, rewards, and punishments. That was enough. But what this absence reveals is a profound question. Without some standard outside of the law, how do you judge whether a law is just? The legalists had no answer. The law was the law. Following it was virtue. Breaking it was vice. Full stop. Every tradition that has tried to enforce morality purely through external punishment has eventually confronted this problem. If the only thing keeping people honest is fear of punishment, what keeps the punishers honest? Throughout all of these different traditions, there is one concept that appears again and again, shaping the way Chinese political thought understood power and its limits. It is the concept that has already been mentioned, the mandate of heaven, Tianming. The idea is this: a ruler holds power legitimately only so long as he governs well. If he governs badly, if he becomes cruel, oppressive, self-serving, if the people suffer under his rule, then heaven withdraws its mandate. And when the mandate is withdrawn, the ruler falls. This sounds on the surface like a divine right of kings in reverse. God gives power and God takes it away. But the Chinese version is actually quite different from the European doctrine of divine right, and the difference is important. In the European tradition, the divine right of kings meant that the king's power came directly from God, and was therefore essentially unconditional. To rebel against the king was to rebel against God. The king's accountability was primarily upward to God, not downward to the people. In the Chinese tradition, the mandate of heaven was precisely conditional. The standard against which the ruler was measured was not ritual purity or theological correctness, but practical governance. Did the people have enough food? Were there wars? Was the bureaucracy honest? Was taxation fair? Were disasters managed well? If the answer to these questions was yes, heaven supported the ruler. If the answer was no, it did not. And the withdrawal of the mandate was evidenced not by any supernatural sign, but by the natural consequences of bad governance. Floods mismanaged, famines not relieved, peasant rebellions rising, armies losing battles. This is a theory of political legitimacy that is both deeply pragmatic and also deeply moral. It says, power is legitimate when it serves the people. It is not legitimate simply because it exists or because it has been ratified by some divine authority. The test of legitimacy is practical and ongoing. It also says, peasants who revolt against a tyrant are not sinners. They are instruments of heaven, correcting an imbalance in the cosmic order. This made the concept of the mandate of heaven simultaneously a tool of dynastic legitimation used by every new dynasty to justify why it had the right to replace the previous one, and a tool of political critique available to anyone who wanted to argue that a given ruler had lost the right to rule. The question this raises for us is one that is still very much alive. What makes power legitimate? Is it divine appointment, popular consent, technical competence, historical tradition, the practical outcomes it produces? Most Western democracies would say, popular consent. The people give the government its authority through the vote and can withdraw it. This sounds quite different from the mandate of heaven, but notice that both theories share a crucial assumption. Power is not self-justifying. It derives its legitimacy from something outside itself. In the Western theory, that something is the will of the people. In the Chinese theory, it is the moral order of heaven, as expressed through social outcomes, and in both cases, the question of how you actually enforce this accountability on those who hold power is enormously difficult. The Chinese answer was, you cannot finally enforce it through any human mechanism. The ruler who loses the mandate will eventually fall because the consequences of bad governance are cumulative and eventually catastrophic. But this might take a very long time, and a lot of people suffer in the meantime. This is the part that the concept of the mandate of heaven cannot make comfortable. Justice may eventually be done, in the sense that bad governance eventually destroys itself. But the justice is cold and impersonal, and often comes far too late for the actual human beings who bore the consequences. There is no God who intervenes to stop the suffering before the dynasty falls. There is only the slow, impersonal working out of consequences. Is this moral order, or is it mere physics? The distinction is one that Chinese philosophy has never fully resolved, because it was never quite sure those were different things. Chinese philosophy, for most of its early history, was fundamentally this worldly tradition. Its concerns were ethical, social, and political. It was interested in how to live, how to govern, how to relate to the natural order of things. It was not particularly interested in liberation from the cycle of birth and death, because most of the early Chinese schools did not believe in such a cycle. Then, roughly 2,000 years ago, Buddhism arrived from India, and it changed everything. Buddhism brought with it a whole new set of questions. Questions about suffering and its causes. Questions about the nature of the self and whether there is truly a self at all. Questions about rebirth and karma and the possibility of escaping the cycle of suffering altogether. Questions about enlightenment and the nature of consciousness. It also brought a very different moral psychology, where Confucianism focused on relationships and role, Buddhism focused on the interior life. Where the Taoists were interested in alignment with the natural flow of things, Buddhism was interested in the liberation from attachment and craving. Where the legalists were interested in behavioral compliance, Buddhism was interested in the transformation of the mind itself. Buddhism, in its original Indian form, did not have a creator god either. The Buddha, when asked about the origins of the universe, tended to say that these questions were not useful ones. Whether the universe had a beginning, whether it was finite or infinite, whether the soul was the same as the body or different, none of these questions, he said, had answers that would help you escape suffering. They were, in his famous phrase, questions that do not tend to edification. This put early Buddhism in an interesting position relative to Chinese thought. On the question of God, Confucianism and Buddhism were similarly agnostic, though for different reasons. Confucius was not interested in the question because he was primarily concerned with this worldly ethics. The Buddha was not interested in the question because he was primarily concerned with suffering and liberation, and God did not feature in his analysis of either. But Buddhism brought something that the early Chinese traditions lacked: a detailed psychology of the interior life and a promise of liberation that extended beyond this particular life. The Chinese response to Buddhism was fascinating and is worth dwelling on. At first, there was resistance. Buddhist ideas about monks renouncing family life, about the priority of the individual's liberation over social relationships, about the cycle of rebirth. All of this was deeply foreign to the Confucian sensibility, which held family relationships sacred, and this worldly social harmony as the primary goal. Then there was adaptation. Chinese thinkers took what was useful from Buddhism and rewrote it in Chinese terms. The result was traditions like Chan Buddhism, which in Japan became Zen, a form of Buddhism so thoroughly transformed by Chinese sensibilities that it is barely recognizable as the same tradition that came from India. Chan Buddhism has no interest in elaborate doctrine, very little interest in scripture, and a great deal of interest in direct experience. In the kind of sudden insight or gradual cultivation that leads to a quality of being very similar to what the Taoists called alignment with the Tao. Eventually, the three traditions, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, settled into a kind of uneasy coexistence that the Chinese described with a saying, "The three teachings are one." They were not actually one. They disagreed about many things, but they coexisted within individual lives in a way that would be quite strange to Western eyes. A person might follow Confucian ethics in their public and family life, Taoist principles when seeking health or dealing with the natural world, and Buddhist practices when confronting death and seeking inner peace. What did they all have in common? They all placed the primary responsibility for moral and spiritual development on the individual and the community. rather than on divine intervention from outside. They all, in different ways, located the source of goodness immanent within the structure of reality itself, rather than transcendent in a divine person. And none of them, in their philosophical heart, required God. Several hundred years after Buddhism arrived in China, a group of thinkers began the enormous intellectual project of rebuilding Confucianism on new foundations. They took the Confucian concern with ethics and social harmony, added the Buddhist depth of psychological and metaphysical inquiry, and produced something that would shape Chinese civilization for the next 1,000 years. These thinkers are called the Neo-Confucians, and the most important of them is a man named Zhuangzi, who lived from 1130 to 1200 CE during the Song dynasty. Zhuangzi faced a genuine intellectual crisis. The Buddhist challenge to Confucianism had been serious. The Buddhists had a comprehensive account of the nature of reality, of the self, of consciousness, of the causes of suffering, and of the path to liberation. The early Confucians had ethics and social philosophy, but they lacked the kind of deep metaphysical foundation that could respond to Buddhist challenges on their own terms. Zhuangzi built that foundation. He developed an account of reality based on two fundamental concepts: li, which in his usage means something like principle or pattern, and qi, which means something like vital force or material energy. Everything that exists, from the smallest grain of rice to the largest mountain to the moral order of human relationships, is a manifestation of these two fundamental constituents of reality. Li is the principle that makes a thing what it is. The li of a dog is what makes a dog rather than a cat. The lie of a human being is what makes a human being rather than an animal. And the lie of a human being includes fundamentally moral principles. The principle of humanity, Ren, is built into what a human being is at the deepest level. This is the Neo-Confucian answer to the question of where morality comes from. It does not come from God's commandments. It does not come from social agreement. It comes from the structure of reality itself. Morality is not imposed on the universe from outside. It is woven into the fabric of things. To be moral is to be aligned with your own deepest nature. To be immoral is to act against what you fundamentally are. This is a breathtaking philosophical move. It means that when you do good, you are not merely obeying an external rule or pleasing a divine being. You are being fully what you are. You are expressing your own nature correctly. And when you do evil, you are not just breaking a rule or disappointing God. You are somehow failing to be yourself. You are acting against your own essence. The implications are enormous. Moral failure is not primarily sin in the Western sense, a transgression against a divine command. It is more like illness, a failure of proper function, a deviation from the natural order of what a thing should be. And the cure for moral failure is not primarily repentance before God. It is cultivation, education, the gradual realignment of the self with the line that is already present in its depths. Zhuangzi spent enormous energy on the question of moral cultivation. He believed that you had to investigate the principles of things carefully, that learning and self-examination were essential. He wrote commentaries on the 4 books of Confucian canon that became the basis of the Chinese educational and examination system for the next 700 years. Every scholar who wanted to pass the imperial examinations had to know Zhuangzi's interpretations. This gave Neo-Confucianism an extraordinary influence on Chinese civilization. It shaped who got to hold power, what values were explicitly endorsed by the state, what kind of person was considered educated and worthy of responsibility. But it also raised a question that is still uncomfortable. If virtue is the natural expression of what human beings are, why is there so much evil? Why do people so consistently fail to live according to their deepest nature? The Neo-Confucian answer involved the concept of qi. While li is the principle of things, qi is the material through which principles are expressed, and qi can be cloudy or clear, dense or refined. A person with refined, clear qi will find it easier to express the lie of humanity correctly. A person with cloudy or dense qi will struggle. This sounds like it might be saying that some people are inherently more virtuous than others by nature, and this raises questions about responsibility and fairness that the Neo-Confucians never entirely resolved. If your capacity for virtue is partly determined by the quality of your qi, which you did not choose, then how accountable are you for your failures? This is a question that every moral tradition eventually confronts in some form. Is goodness something you can always choose, regardless of your circumstances and constitution? Or does genuine moral agency require certain conditions that not everyone has equally? Christianity has its doctrine of grace. Buddhism has its concept of karma and the slow purification across many lives. The Neo-Confucians had the refinement of qi through sustained moral cultivation. None of these answers is completely satisfying, and none of them requires God. We have been moving through 2,500 years of Chinese philosophy, and we have seen again and again ethical systems of great sophistication and depth that do not require a divine lawgiver to hold them up. Confucianism grounds morality in human nature and the requirements of social life. Taoism grounds it in the natural order of things. Neo-Confucianism grounds it in the metaphysical structure of reality itself. Buddhism grounds it in the nature of suffering and the conditions for liberation. But there is a question that each of these traditions has to answer, and that Western religious thought uses God to answer. The question is, why should I be moral when it costs me? Specifically, why should I be moral when I could get away with being immoral? When the immoral action would benefit me and I could avoid punishment? When nobody is watching and nothing bad will happen to me if I choose wrong? The God-based answer is because God is always watching, because there will be a final judgment, because the consequences of immorality extend beyond this life and beyond human detection. You cannot get away with it, ultimately, even if you appear to. The Chinese traditions have different answers, and they are worth examining carefully. The Confucian answer is roughly this: you should be moral because immorality deforms the self. The person who consistently chooses selfishness over virtue is not just making choices, they are becoming a certain kind of person. A person who is harder, more isolated, less capable of genuine connection and love. The damage is not external punishment, but internal corruption. And because human beings are social creatures who cannot flourish in isolation, this internal corruption eventually produces external consequences: broken relationships, loss of trust, social exclusion. The Taoist answer is more abstract, but also more radical. The question itself, why should I be moral, is already off track. It assumes a separation between what I want and what morality requires. The Taoist sage does not experience this separation. She acts in accordance with the natural flow of things, not because she has calculated that it is good strategy, but because she has aligned herself with the Tao so thoroughly that anything else would feel like violence to her own nature. The question only arises for people who have not yet achieved this alignment. For them, it is indeed a question. And the answer is, because the suffering produced by acting against the natural order is real, even if delayed and diffuse, and aligning with the Tao produces a quality of ease and peace that is its own reward. The Mohist answer is the most interesting and most historically underappreciated. Mozi says, because other people's suffering is real, you should care about it because it is real, not because you will be punished if you do not, and not because it aligns with your self-interest, and not because it expresses your deepest nature. Suffering hurts. It hurts in you when you feel it, and it hurts in them when they feel it. That fact is sufficient if you have genuinely internalized this. The question, why should I care about others, is as puzzling as why should I prefer not to be in pain? And the legalist answer, which is the least moralistic of all, is you should not count on human beings being moral. Design systems where morality and self-interest align as closely as possible, and do not leave gaps where immorality pays. None of these answers is God. None of them offers the comfort of a final accounting, a complete justice that sees everything and sets everything right. They are all, in different ways, accounts of how to build a moral life in a universe that is not running it for you. And here is the question that makes this genuinely difficult. The question that keeps you awake at night. What happens when the Confucian self-defamation argument fails? When someone is genuinely capable of corruption without apparent psychological consequence? When the Taoist answer requires a level of spiritual development that most people have not reached? When the Mohist appeal to the reality of suffering is met with indifference? When the legalist system is itself captured by the powerful? What happens when being immoral actually works for a particular person in a particular life from beginning to end? The Chinese traditions do not have a comfortable answer to this. The idea of karma, borrowed from Buddhism, offers some consolation. What is not settled in this life is carried forward into the next. But this requires belief in rebirth, which is itself a form of transcendence, and which many of the Chinese traditions, particularly Confucianism, are not committed to. The honest answer, the answer that Chinese philosophy perhaps forces you toward more directly than Western religious thought does, is sometimes immorality works. Sometimes people cause great suffering and are never held accountable. Sometimes the good suffer and the wicked prosper. The moral order of the universe, if there is one, is not a guarantee of justice for every individual. This is deeply uncomfortable. It is also, arguably, closer to what we actually observe. The question then becomes, does this make morality merely optional? Or does it make morality something more heroic? Something you choose not because the universe enforces it, but because you have decided that this is who you want to be, regardless of the consequences, regardless of whether anyone is watching, regardless of whether justice is ever done. There is a kind of moral dignity in this that is perhaps not available to someone who is primarily motivated by divine reward and punishment. The person who does good only because God will punish them if they do not is not quite the same kind of moral agent as the person who does good in a universe that offers no such guarantee. Which kind of goodness is deeper? Which kind is more admirable? The Chinese tradition, mostly implicitly, but sometimes explicitly, votes for the second kind. We have come a long way together through the night. We began in a China that was fracturing, where old certainties were dissolving and brilliant minds were asking how to live in a world that no longer had clear answers. We followed Confucius through the courts of indifferent rulers, gathering students who would carry his ideas forward for millennia. We sat with Laozi at the edge of what can be said, looking into a silence that he called the Tao. We played with Zhuangzi in his dreams, or maybe in ours, trying to work out whether anything is as solid as it appears. We listened to Mozi argue for a love so wide it made everyone uncomfortable. We sat in the cold court of the legalists and heard their bleak but penetrating argument about the limits of moral idealism. We watched Buddhism arrive from India and slowly transform itself into something Chinese, and then watched the Neo-Confucians build a metaphysics of virtue grand enough to run an empire. And through all of it, God was mostly absent. Not because these thinkers had failed to ask the question, but because the question, when they asked it, led them somewhere else, to the structure of things, to the nature of human relationships, to the slow, patient work of becoming fully what a human being can be. There is one final question worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep. Western philosophical and religious traditions often describe the problem of evil as the biggest challenge to belief in God. If God is all-powerful and all good, why does suffering exist? This is a question that has troubled every serious religious thinker for 2,000 years, and nobody has fully resolved it. Chinese philosophy does not have the problem of evil in this form. It cannot have it. Without a God who is supposed to prevent suffering, the existence of suffering is not a philosophical problem. It is just a fact about reality that needs to be responded to. But this creates a different problem, which you might call the problem of meaning. If the universe is not running a moral court, if there is no final accounting, if goodness is not guaranteed to be rewarded or evil to be punished, then what exactly is the moral order? Is there one? And if there is not, in the sense of a cosmic enforcement mechanism, does that mean that when we speak of right and wrong, we are really only speaking about what we happen to prefer, about social conventions that we have agreed to maintain but could abandon if we wanted to? The Neo-Confucians would say, no. The moral principles are real. They are woven into the fabric of things as surely as the principles of physics. You cannot violate the lie of humanity without consequences, just as you cannot violate the laws of gravity without consequences. The consequences may be subtle and slow, but they are real. The Taoists would say, the question itself is still slightly off. There is no moral order in the sense of a system of rules and enforcement. There is the Tao, which is neither moral nor immoral in human terms, but simply the natural order of how things move. Aligning with it produces a kind of ease that you might describe as good. Acting against it produces a kind of friction that you might describe as bad. But these are not really categories the Tao itself recognizes. They are human readings of something that precedes human categories. Zhuangzi would probably laugh at all of this and tell you a story about a cook. There is in the Zhuangzi a famous story about a cook who carves an ox with such perfect skill that his blade never touches bone or sinew, always finding the natural spaces between. The prince watching him is amazed, and the cook explains that he has studied the ox for years and now sees not the whole animal but the natural structure within it. He does not cut, he follows. He works with the grain of things rather than against it. This, Zhuangzi says, is the model for everything. The sage who has understood the Tao does not force their way through life. They find the natural grain of each situation and move with it. No violence, no struggle, no exhaustion. Perfect competence that looks like ease. Is this a description of moral action? Is it a description of practical skill? Is it a description of spiritual realization? It is all three, because in this tradition, these are not separate things. You are already in bed, or almost there. The room is quiet and the day is done, and the questions are still open, which is exactly where they belong. The philosophers were not trying to close these questions. They were trying to make it possible to live with them comfortably, the way you learn to live with the fact that the universe is older than you can imagine and will continue long after you are gone. And somehow that fact is not terrifying, or not only terrifying, but also vast and quiet and full. The Chinese tradition looked at a universe without a personal God watching over it, and instead of despair, they found something more interesting. An invitation to take seriously the work of becoming fully human, to take relationships seriously, to take rituals seriously, to take the natural order seriously, to become so quiet and so attentive that you can hear the grain of things and move with it, rather than against it. This is a different kind of hope than the hope offered by a loving God who hears your prayers. It is more demanding and in some ways less comforting, but it is also in some ways more honest. The universe does not need you to be good. It will continue either way, but you are here, and you have this particular life, and the people around you are real, and their suffering is real, and their joy is real, and the relationships you build or fail to build will last in some form beyond your particular moment. And what you choose to do with all of that is finally and entirely up to you. That is either very heavy or very beautiful. Confucius thought it was both, and so did Laozi, and so did Zhuangzi, laughing in his dream. Sleep well.